The courtroom was filled with whispers, muffled laughter, and amused glances. Judge Patterson leaned back in his chair, shaking his head as he looked down at the 17-year-old black teenager standing before him. "This is a courtroom, not a high school debate club," he scoffed. The prosecution chuckled. The landlord's attorney smirked, barely trying to hide his amusement. But then Maya Brooks spoke, and within seconds, the laughter stopped. The smirks faded. The judge's expression shifted from amusement to shock, because what came next would leave the entire courtroom speechless. Maya Brooks stood in the center of the courtroom, gripping her worn legal pad, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew the odds were stacked against her. The judge, the prosecution, the audience, none of them believed she belonged here. To them, she was just a kid, a girl playing dress-up, pretending to understand the law. Judge Patterson adjusted his glasses, tapping his gavel against the desk, barely containing his irritation. "Miss Brooks, this is highly irregular," he sighed. "Do you even understand the seriousness of this case?" The courtroom chuckled. The landlord's attorney smirked. Even some of the spectators shook their heads, amused at the idea that this teenage girl actually thought she could stand in court and argue against experienced lawyers. Maya, however, didn't flinch. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady, "I understand the seriousness of this case better than anyone." Judge Patterson leaned forward, raising an eyebrow. "Oh, really?" Maya took a deep breath, keeping her expression calm. "Yes, Your Honor. Because for my client, this case isn't just about legal arguments or courtroom procedures. It's about survival. It's about her home. It's about whether she and her children will have a roof over their heads next month." A murmur rippled through the audience. For the first time, the judge actually looked at her. Not as a joke, not as a child, but as someone who had something important to say. Maya knew she had their attention now. To everyone in that courtroom, Maya was just an ordinary 17-year-old girl. But what they didn't know was that Maya had spent most of her childhood doing something no one expected: studying law. Raised by her grandmother, Clara, Maya had grown up in a tiny apartment filled with books. Clara, a retired schoolteacher, believed in the power of knowledge. And while other kids played outside, Maya spent her time flipping through legal textbooks, fascinated by the complexities of the law. By the time she was 12, she wasn't just reading, she was debating. She spent hours arguing mock cases online, taking part in forums with college students who had no idea they were talking to a middle schooler. She memorized Supreme Court cases the way other kids memorized song lyrics. But Maya never wanted the spotlight. She had no plans of stepping into a courtroom until one day everything changed. It started in the corner store near her house. Maya had just grabbed a bottle of juice when she overheard a woman at the checkout counter, her voice trembling. "I don't have anywhere to go," the woman, Teresa Carter, whispered. Maya turned. Teresa's hands were shaking as she clutched a wrinkled eviction notice. The cashier gave her a sympathetic look, but sympathy wouldn't stop her and her two kids from being thrown out on the street. Maya stepped closer. "Excuse me. What happened?" Teresa sighed, wiping at her eyes. "My landlord says I broke the lease, claims I have extra people living with me, but it's just me and my kids." Maya frowned. "That sounds suspicious." Teresa let out a bitter laugh. "Doesn't matter. I can't afford a lawyer to fight it." Maya hesitated, then said the words that would change both of their lives. "What if I help you?" Teresa blinked. "Sweetheart, I appreciate it, but you're just a kid." Maya smiled. "I've been told that before." That night, Maya sat at her grandmother's kitchen table, legal books spread out in front of her, scanning through every detail of Teresa's lease. And within minutes, she found the problem. The eviction notice was a lie. The landlord had no real grounds for kicking Teresa out. It wasn't about a lease violation. It was about money. He wanted to push her out so he could charge a new tenant more rent. Maya's hands curled into fists. This wasn't just unfair. It was illegal. So she got to work. She drafted a formal legal response, citing housing laws and tenant protections. She mailed it to the landlord, demanding he retract the eviction notice. But instead of backing down, the landlord pushed harder. 2 days later, Teresa called, panic in her voice. "Maya, someone came to my door." Maya sat up straight. "What do you mean?" "A man. He said I should drop this case, and that I couldn't win." Maya's blood boiled. This was intimidation. She knew then that she had no choice. If the landlord wanted a fight, he was going to get one, and she was going to take him to court. The trial had barely started, and Maya was already facing resistance. Judge Patterson sighed, rubbing his temples. "Miss Brooks, do you even have legal experience?" Maya didn't hesitate. "Your Honor, I have studied every aspect of tenant law relevant to this case. I have prepared all the necessary evidence, and, most importantly, my client has the right to have her case heard." The judge narrowed his eyes. "And you truly believe you're qualified to argue this case?" Maya held his gaze. "With all due respect, Your Honor, if the law is on my side, why should my age matter?" A few murmurs rippled through the room. The judge exhaled slowly. "Fine. You may proceed." Maya turned to the prosecution, meeting their smug expressions with steady confidence. They had no idea what was coming. Maya Brooks had spent most of her childhood buried in books, absorbing legal knowledge like a sponge. She understood the law better than most adults, yet no one took her seriously because of her age. She never imagined she'd be stepping into a courtroom before even finishing high school. But when she met Teresa Carter, she knew she couldn't stand by and do nothing. It all started with a simple grocery run. Maya had been waiting in line at a small corner store when she overheard a woman sobbing quietly at the checkout counter. Teresa, a single mother, was clutching a crumpled eviction notice in her shaking hands. "I swear, I didn't do anything wrong," she pleaded with the cashier, her voice trembling. "He's lying. I've paid every cent on time." Maya's ears perked up. Something about the desperation in Teresa's voice made her turn. "What happened?" she asked gently. Teresa looked at the teenager, clearly hesitant. "Oh, honey, it's nothing. Just, my landlord says I violated the lease and now he's kicking me out. Says I have too many people living with me. But it's just me and my kids." Maya frowned. That didn't sound right. "Did he give you an official notice?" Teresa hesitated before pulling out the eviction letter from her purse. Maya scanned it quickly. The wording was vague, filled with legal jargon meant to confuse. "Something's off," Maya muttered. Teresa let out a sad laugh. "Doesn't matter. I don't have money for a lawyer." Maya felt a spark of determination ignite inside her. "What if I help you?" Teresa blinked. "Help me? Sweetheart, I appreciate it, but—" She paused, glancing at Maya's young face. "You're just a kid." Maya smiled. "I've been told that before." That night, Maya stayed up late, poring over housing laws and tenant rights. Within an hour, she knew Teresa's landlord had no legal ground to evict her. This wasn't about a lease violation. This was about money. Maya discovered that the landlord had a pattern of pushing out low-income tenants, only to raise the rent for new tenants. This was fraud. The next morning, she drafted a formal letter challenging the eviction, citing laws that protected tenants from wrongful removal. She mailed it to the landlord, expecting him to back down. But she had underestimated how ruthless he was. 2 days later, Teresa called, her voice shaking. "Maya, someone came to my door." Maya's stomach dropped. "What?" "A man. He said I should drop this case, that I can't win." This was intimidation. Maya clenched her fists. If the landlord thought he could scare them into giving up, he was wrong. She had one last option. She was taking him to court. Maya knew the landlord wasn't going to back down. If anything, his attempt at intimidation only made her more determined. Teresa, however, wasn't as confident. She sat at Maya's kitchen table, nervously twisting her hands together. "Maya, are you sure about this?" she asked. "I don't want to cause more trouble. If he can send someone to threaten me, what else can he do?" Maya flipped through the stack of legal papers she had printed. "That's exactly why we can't back down, Teresa. This isn't just about you. If we don't stop him, he'll keep doing this to other families. And legally, we have the upper hand." Teresa sighed, glancing at the eviction notice again. "I just don't understand. How can he do this? I paid my rent. I followed the lease. And now I have to fight just to keep a roof over my kids' heads?" Maya met her eyes. "Because people like him assume no one will fight back." She pushed a document toward Teresa. "But we will." Maya spent the next few nights gathering every possible piece of evidence she could. She looked into previous tenants of Reynolds' properties and discovered a disturbing pattern. At least 5 other families had been evicted under similar circumstances over the past 2 years. Each eviction followed the same process: a sudden lease violation, a rushed court order, and then within weeks the apartment was rented out again at a much higher price. This wasn't a one-time mistake, it was a business strategy. She compiled payment records proving Teresa had paid her rent on time every single month. She reached out to former tenants, getting sworn statements about their forced evictions. She printed out copies of the landlord's online rental listings, showing how apartments were being posted before eviction cases were even finalized. By the time she was done, she didn't just have a defense, she had a case strong enough to destroy Reynolds in court. On the day of the hearing, the courtroom was packed. Reporters had gotten wind of the story: a 17-year-old girl representing a tenant against a wealthy landlord. Even experienced lawyers had shown up, some out of curiosity, others to see what kind of train wreck this would be. Judge Patterson peered down at Maya from his bench, unimpressed. "Miss Brooks," he sighed, flipping through the paperwork, "I must say, I don't believe I've ever seen a teenager represent someone in my courtroom before." Maya stood tall. "There's a first time for everything, Your Honor." A few chuckles echoed through the courtroom, but Maya didn't let it shake her confidence. The judge sighed. "Very well, Mr. Davidson, you may begin." The landlord's attorney, a tall man with graying hair, smirked as he stood. "Your Honor, I'll keep this short. The lease agreement states that only immediate family may reside in the apartment. We have documented proof that multiple people were seen regularly coming and going. This is a clear violation of the contract." He turned toward Maya. "And while I admire the young lady's enthusiasm, I think we can all agree that a courtroom is no place for a child to play lawyer." The audience chuckled again. Even the judge smirked. But Maya? She remained perfectly calm. She stood up, taking her time, ensuring every movement was deliberate. "Your Honor," she began, "the defense claims that my client violated her lease agreement, but what they're actually doing is twisting the facts to fit their agenda." She walked toward the projector where the defense had displayed grainy surveillance photos of Teresa's apartment. "These images," she said, pointing to them, "show people entering and leaving the building, but they fail to do one crucial thing: identify who these people actually are." She turned to the jury. "The defense wants you to assume my client is harboring extra tenants, but let's break this down." She pointed to the first image. "This is her neighbor who brings groceries." The next image. "This is her sister who visits to babysit." She turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, there is no lease agreement in existence that forbids tenants from having visitors. Unless the defense has proof that these individuals are actually living in the apartment, their entire argument collapses." Judge Patterson's smirk faded slightly. The landlord's attorney frowned. "Miss Brooks, while that may be true, the financial aspect cannot be ignored. The reality is that Miss Carter has struggled with rent payments before and—" Maya didn't let him finish. "Let's talk about that." She walked over to the plaintiff's table and lifted a stack of documents. "These are records of every rent payment my client has made over the last 2 years. You'll notice that not only has she paid her rent in full, but she has never once been late. She walked toward the judge's bench and handed the documents to the bailiff. Your Honor, I'd also like to present evidence that my client's apartment was listed for rent at a higher price before she was even given her eviction notice. Gasps rippled through the room. Judge Patterson flipped through the documents, his expression darkening. Maya continued. This isn't about a lease violation. This is about a landlord using intimidation and false claims to force tenants out so he can raise the rent. She turned back toward the defense attorney. Do you deny that Mr. Reynolds has evicted at least 5 other tenants under similar circumstances in the past 2 years? Davidson's face paled. The courtroom was dead silent. Maya took a deep breath, steadying herself. She knew she had them cornered. She looked directly at the judge. Your Honor, we are not just asking for this eviction to be overturned. We are asking for a full investigation into Mr. Reynolds' business practices. The defense attorney quickly stood. Your Honor, we request a recess. No, Maya cut in. They've had weeks to prepare. The evidence is here. We demand a ruling. Judge Patterson rubbed his temples, looking from Maya to the landlord, whose smugness had completely disappeared. For the first time, the power had shifted. Maya had control of the courtroom now, and she wasn't letting go. The courtroom was suffocatingly silent. No more whispers, no more muffled laughter. Every eye was on Maya Brooks, the teenage girl who had just done the unthinkable. Judge Patterson, who had spent most of the trial looking at her with skepticism, was now rubbing his temples, his expression unreadable. The landlord, Mr. Reynolds, was gripping the edge of the table, his face pale. His attorney, Mr. Davidson, was flipping through his paperwork in panic, searching desperately for a way to counter Maya's argument. But there was no counter, no loophole. Maya had ripped their case apart, piece by piece. Judge Patterson exhaled sharply. Miss Brooks, I'll admit, you've certainly presented a compelling argument. Maya nodded. Thank you, Your Honor. The judge turned to the defense. Mr. Davidson, do you have any explanation for why Mr. Reynolds' properties were listed at a higher rent before the tenants were even evicted? Davidson cleared his throat, standing. Your Honor, with all due respect, the rental market fluctuates, and landlords must prepare for potential vacancies in advance. Maya's lips curled slightly. Except, that's not what's happening here. She pulled out another document and handed it to the bailiff. This is a copy of the lease agreements of 3 previous tenants who were evicted in the same way. If you compare the eviction dates and the new rental listings, you'll see a pattern. Not only were the apartments relisted at a much higher rent, but in every case, new tenants moved in almost immediately after the evictions were finalized. That suggests these evictions weren't due to lease violations at all. They were premeditated rent hikes. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Judge Patterson flipped through the pages, his jaw tightening. Mr. Davidson, I suggest you answer her question. Davidson glanced at Reynolds, who shook his head frantically. His hands trembled as he whispered something under his breath. Davidson sighed. Your Honor, my client would like to request a settlement discussion with the plaintiff. Maya lifted her chin. A settlement? You mean now that you realize you can't win? You'd like to negotiate? Davidson's jaw clenched. Miss Brooks, this is a courtroom, not a spectacle. Maya's eyes burned with determination. No, Mr. Davidson. What this is a clear attempt to silence my client with hush money. If you truly believed your case had merit, we wouldn't be having this conversation right now. She turned to Judge Patterson. Your Honor, I respectfully decline any settlement. We're here for a ruling. Reynolds slammed his hands on the table. This is ridiculous. She's just a kid. She shouldn't even be here. The judge banged his gavel. Mr. Reynolds, one more outburst and I will hold you in contempt. Reynolds clenched his jaw but fell silent. Maya took a deep breath. Your Honor, I have one last piece of evidence. Judge Patterson sighed, gesturing for her to continue. Maya reached into her folder and pulled out an email printout. This is an email exchange between Mr. Reynolds and his real estate broker. She handed it to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. In this email, dated 3 months before my client's eviction, Mr. Reynolds specifically asks the broker how much he could charge for my client's unit if he could get her out by the end of the lease term. Judge Patterson read the email, and for the first time his face darkened with something that looked dangerously close to anger. Maya let the weight of her words settle before delivering her final statement. This wasn't about a lease violation. It was never about my client's supposed guests. This was about profit. Mr. Reynolds targeted my client, like he has targeted others before her, because he thought no one would fight back. But today, he learned something new. She paused, then looked directly at Reynolds. He learned that justice doesn't have an age limit. The silence in the courtroom stretched long enough to make even the air feel heavy. Judge Patterson tapped his fingers against the desk before finally speaking. "This court finds in favor of the plaintiff," he said firmly. "The eviction is overturned." The room erupted into a mix of gasps and applause. But the judge wasn't finished. He glanced at Maya before turning to Reynolds. "Furthermore, based on the evidence presented today, I will be forwarding this case to the state's Attorney General for an official investigation into Mr. Reynolds' business practices." Reynolds' face turned a deep shade of red. "You can't do this!" The judge narrowed his eyes. "I absolutely can." Reynolds tried to stand, but his attorney yanked his sleeve, whispering something urgently in his ear. His face twisted in fury, but he slumped back down in his seat. Maya turned to Teresa, who was covering her mouth, tears streaming down her face. "We won," she whispered. Maya smiled. "We won." As soon as the hearing ended, reporters swarmed Maya outside the courthouse. "Miss Brooks, how does it feel to win your first case at 17? What's next for you? Are you planning to become an attorney? Were you intimidated going up against a seasoned lawyer?" Maya raised her hand, silencing the crowd. "This case was never about me," she said firmly. "This was about Teresa Carter and every other tenant who has been taken advantage of by corrupt landlords. People think that just because you don't have money, you don't have power. Today, we proved them wrong." The cameras flashed, reporters scribbling down her words. And just like that, Maya Brooks became a viral sensation. A month after the trial, news broke that Mr. Reynolds was under criminal investigation. Multiple tenants came forward with similar stories. Some had been forced out, others had been pressured into paying extra fees illegally. The Attorney General's office opened an official case, and within weeks, Reynolds' real estate empire crumbled. He was sued for fraudulent business practices. His assets were frozen. His properties were seized. One day, Maya happened to be passing by the courthouse when she saw a familiar face. Reynolds, now disheveled and exhausted, stepping out in handcuffs. Their eyes met for a moment. His once arrogant smirk was gone. "Maya!" She simply smiled. Justice had been served. A few weeks after the trial, Maya received an unexpected letter from a prestigious law firm. They had followed her case and were so impressed with her skills that they wanted to offer her mentorship and early legal training. She reread the letter in disbelief. "Grandma," she whispered, turning to Clara, who was reading over her shoulder. "They want me to train with real attorneys." Clara smiled proudly. "I always knew you were meant for something bigger." Maya looked at the letter again, her heart racing. Maybe, just maybe, this was only the beginning. Maya Brooks walked out of the courtroom that day as more than just a teenager who had won a case. She was a symbol of justice. She had gone up against a seasoned attorney, a corrupt landlord, and an entire system designed to silence people like Teresa. And she had won. But this wasn't the end. News of Maya's victory spread like wildfire. More tenants, inspired by her courage, started coming forward with their own eviction horror stories. Within months, her case had sparked a full-scale investigation into unethical landlords exploiting vulnerable tenants. Reynolds, once a powerful real estate mogul, was now facing multiple lawsuits and criminal charges. His empire crumbled, and the same legal system he had manipulated for years was now holding him accountable. As for Maya, she didn't stop there. She officially launched the Justice Collective, an initiative dedicated to helping tenants fight unlawful evictions. What started as a single case grew into something much bigger, a movement, and it was only the beginning. If you love powerful stories like this, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one.